Hi everyone. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to go over with you how to write up the independent research project. So this is part of the portfolio, which is Unit 2 of the Trinity Diploma in TESOL. So we'll talk about what should go in each section of the report, as well as some common mistakes that candidates make. Unlike the other two parts of the portfolio, the classroom observation instrument and the personal development record, this assignment's really quite open. There's a lot of options for you in terms of what you choose to investigate. So as with the other sections, there's only really three main areas in terms of the marks. There's the rationale at the beginning and the research focus, the quality and the relevance of the data that you record, the evaluation and conclusions and implications, and finally the presentation. So let's take those one by one. Let's start off with the rationale and the statement of the research focused. It's important to remember with this, as with the other parts of the portfolio, the person reading it probably won't be familiar with your context, where you work, what students you teach, all those kind of things. So make sure that you clearly describe your context in the beginning. But unlike the other sections of the portfolio, this part doesn't necessarily need to relate to your own teaching. So it could be about your role as a trainer or manager or materials writer or something else. So if your project relates to, let's say, designing a course for your students, then tell us why you're designing that course, who your students are, those kind of things. Some of your marks here are for a clear rationale, so make sure you include some background reading on the topic. Tell us why you're interested in the topic, and make sure that that background reading that you have at the beginning really informs how you collect your data later on. So let's say that you're looking at the professional development in your school and evaluating that. Your reading and literature review at the beginning should maybe outline some different options for professional development and best practices and some of the main issues related to that. So the other marks in this section are for the research. So the other marks here are for a statement of your research focus. So be really clear in what you want to achieve and why. And make sure this is something practical. So sticking with that professional development example, instead of just evaluating the professional development in your school, you can take your research focus a step further and aim to propose changes to improve the professional development for teachers in your school. You'll obviously still need to evaluate it, but you have to take it a step further and give some proposals. Some of the things you might want to include in this section are maybe something on the ethics of your research, data protection, for example, for people who've replied to your survey, if you've done a survey. And something else that's really important to include here is your research rationale. So remember, the first part of the portfolio, the classroom observation instrument, it's really set that you're going to collect data through observing classes. But here, there's so many different options for how you could collect data. It could be surveys, interviews, observations, transcripts, focus groups. There's obviously so many different options there. So say how you're going to collect data for your project and say why you're going to collect it in this way. So for example, if you've chosen to use a survey, which is very common, why did you choose to use a survey? If you're going to interview people, why are interviews useful? All right, so let's move on to the next section. So the marks here are for the quality and relevance of the data that you collect. So obviously the first part of this has to be presenting the data that you collected. An issue, I think, with all three sections of the portfolio is you don't have too many words to play with, 3,300. So don't include all of the data that you collected in this section. Include the things that are relevant. What does relevant mean? Well, that goes back to your research aim. So let's say you're doing your project on the needs or better understanding the needs of beginner level students. Well, the data that you present here needs to relate to those needs. And that data then needs to relate to the conclusions and implications that you draw later on. So you don't want to leave any sort of threads hanging here, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. If that's irrelevant, we also need to talk about the quality. Really, this is something that you should have thought about before you come to the write-up. But if you're looking at getting quantitative data and you do a survey and only 7 people reply, well, that's probably not very high quality data. But maybe if you interviewed 4 people for an hour each, you asked follow-up questions, you took notes, you did some analysis of what they said, well, that's probably higher quality data. And it's up to you in this section to demonstrate how high quality your data is. So again, it very much depends on what you've collected, but make sure that things you include here are things that you're going to talk about more in the conclusions and the implications later. Remember, you don't need to comment on your results in the results section. You just need to present the results clearly and leave those comments about the results, what they actually mean, for later on in the conclusions and implications. So let's go on to talk about those. The evaluation conclusions and implications are the most important part of the report in terms of marks. It's 40% of the total. So let's go through those one by one. In terms of the evaluation, just as in the other sections, you need to tell us how effective the research was. And it's useful here to tell us about any of the limitations. So you might want to think about your sample size here. If you did a survey and maybe only 5% of the people you sent the survey to replied, maybe you interviewed several people, but they were all based in the same location, that might have skewed your results. Maybe the questionnaires you sent to students were in English, so limitation there would be that maybe beginner level students might find them difficult to complete. All those kind of things. But also say what was effective. So maybe use more than one method of collecting data, and that might have illuminated the topic from different perspectives. Things like that. Next are the conclusions. So you've presented your data before, but this is your chance to say what it means. So if you're investigating different course books and students' perceptions of them, and you found that one was more popular than the others, well, this is your opportunity to say why you think this happened. But remember, you have to be able to do that using the results that you showed us before. So imagine your conclusions as things that you're hanging on the threads from your results. Or let's say, for example, that you're doing a project where you're looking at the needs of teachers who've just moved to a new city or a new country that your school is based in. In the results, you said that 60% of teachers said that their biggest challenge was apartment hunting and they didn't get enough support for this. This is your opportunity to say why that's probably a challenge for these teachers, but you don't need to say what you're going to do about it yet, because that you can leave for the implications, which is the next section. So the implications is really, what does this mean for you? So what practical actions need to be taken? So again, go back to your aim here and look at what you set out to do in the first place. In the results, we found that teachers reported their biggest problem was apartment hunting. The reason for that is because it's a survival need. And the implication, well, here are the things that I'm going to do to try and help those teachers more in the future, like giving them a list of real estate agents, matching them up with someone who's lived in the country for a long time to help them go apartment hunting, things like that. Or if your aim at the beginning was to propose changes to improve professional development in your school, then this is the place to list what your proposals are. But again, make sure those link back to the results and the conclusions. I also want to talk about the last chunk of the marks, which are for presentation. So 15% of the marks are for organization into a coherent piece of academic writing, style, standard of English, and mechanical accuracy. Some of this obviously relates to how you've structured your report. Let's talk for a minute about academic writing. Now again, you can ignore this if you like, because this is my opinion. Well, in fact, most of this is my opinion, but this part especially, I would highly recommend that you try to simplify your writing. In my experience, many of these reports are very difficult to read because the candidates writing them use long sentences, they try and use the passive voice, they include lots of adverbs. But anyway, here are some tips that I think will help make your report easier to read and get you a higher mark for this presentation section. So firstly, use short sentences. Anything that's more than about 15 or 20 words is a bit too long, so try and cut that down. Use the active voice instead of the passive voice where possible. So in education research papers, it's okay to say, I did this, instead of this was done. That's not the case in some other subject areas, but it is the case in education. Minimize adverbs wherever possible, and try and minimize the number of clauses in each sentence, just so those are easier for the person marking it to be able to understand. So here's a quick example. This is from a paper I read recently. So in the introduction, this candidate wrote, and this is one sentence, according to my teaching experience, in classes aiming to practice reading comprehension with young learners aged 8 to 11 years old, I tend to overly rely on the bottom-up approach of teaching reading. This act of over-reliance on bottom-up strategies often ended up resulting in poor reading comprehension for my learners. So I encourage this person just to change that to, I teach young learners aged 8 to 11. That's one sentence. In reading lessons, I mainly encourage bottom-up strategies. Another sentence. However, I found these to be ineffective. So they've taken 2 very long sentences and just cut them down to 3 much shorter, much simpler ones. We've removed the adverbs and we've only got 1 or 2 clauses per sentence. I also recommend that with that writing, you copy and paste it into an online editor and find out what grade level it is and try and get it to a grade level of something like 6. If you're at grade 11, that probably means it's a bit too difficult to read. Another area I find lots of candidates have difficulty with is referencing. So I highly recommend that you look up how to do this online. But some of my personal top tips are Word has a referencing system that you can use. So if you're typing up your portfolio using Word, then just click on the References tab. That pretty much shows you how to do everything. In general, if you want to reference an idea that someone is given, then you just need the author's surname and the year in the text. And obviously you need more details in the references section. But if you're going to include a direct quotation, you need the surname, the year, and presumably it's from a written article. You need the page number as well. And be consistent with those references. You want to make sure that you're using the same referencing system throughout your paper. All right, so let's summarize some of those main things. So at the beginning, you need to talk about, as usual, where you work, why you're interested in this topic, include some background reading, but you also need to include how you're going to research this topic and why. The next section, you need to present the data that you've collected, but you don't have to present everything. Present things that are going to be relevant in your conclusions and implications, and make sure all of this relates back to your aim. In that final section, evaluate how effective the research was. Tell us about some of the limitations. In the conclusions, comment on the data that you collected. Tell us what it means. And then finally, in the implications, say what this actually means for you, what practical actions can be taken in your context, hopefully by yourself, based on what you found in this project. And then finally, for your academic writing, use short, simple sentences and make sure you've referenced properly. Thanks for listening. Hope that's useful for writing up your independent research project. Good luck.